Hello, everyone. Welcome to another SAJA virtual event. My name is Sri Srinivasan, and I'm the president of SAJA and honored to serve in this 30th anniversary year. We have a fantastic program today where we're going to talk about a very important set of topics. And it's not just a conversation, it's actually a workshop that has been made to really help journalists around the country. We are going to introduce you to our speaker in just a moment. But before that, just to remind you what's happening at SAJA these days, we are trying to do one virtual event every month, and you can find the recordings of our previous sessions online, including you can see right on the front page we have the advanced LinkedIn workshop from last month that you can see. We also have our all-star foreign reporting panel from May that you can find there as well. A reminder that we'd love to have you become a SAJA member if you're not, or to tell your friends. Karandeep Singh just became a SAJA member, and he is formerly at the New York Times in India, now lives and works in Toronto. And our big event coming up, SAJA at 30, October 11th and 12th in New York City. A great excuse to be in New York if you're not here. Please tell your family and friends that you're going to New York and encourage them to join us as well, your colleagues too. We're going to have a opening reception on the 11th at Icon Contemporary, which is a beautiful gallery here, and then all day at the Newmark School on Saturday, the 12th, and then a gala dinner and awards program. So you don't want to miss any of that. So yeah, please check out the information that's here on the website. If you just click on that, we're also looking for your pitches for panels and workshops. So if there's something that you would like to present, or you know somebody who should be presenting, please tell them to join by going on to the saja.org website. Our deadline is July 30th. We've already got some terrific suggestions, and we'd love to see you in the mix as well. So I'm going to stop my screen and now introduce you to Divya Karthikeyan, who's on the SAJA board. Divya is going to come on and say hi. Hi, Divya. She's at Louisville Public Media and is someone who works on very important topics as a journalist and is covering topics in a red state. And we'll talk about that and we'll share her experiences as well. And we're delighted to have her on the board. And she represents the Midwest on the SAJA board, and we're very happy to have her. Thank you, Divya, for setting this up. Maybe you can give us a little bit of background how you decided that we should be doing this particular topic. And you've been very passionate about having these Saturday workshops so that people who are working during weekdays or weeknights are able to join us as well.
Yes, thank you so much for being here, all of you, and thank you, Sri, for that very nice introduction. I'm a race and equity reporter at Louisville Public Media. That's the NPR station in Louisville, Kentucky. I am originally from Chennai, India. I came to the US about 4 years ago, sort of had to learn how these systems worked from ground up. When I started this job, I sort of jumped into covering politics, abortion, and reproductive rights, gerrymandering. And then I shifted to race and equity coverage after a year. It's a new beat that I think a lot of newsrooms have been creating. It's very intersectional. There's a lot to be covered because it just intersects with everything everywhere. I've been covering policing more. Yeah, that's mostly my work. I wanted to put this together because I've always loved Sandhya's work and also the way that she's approached journalism. I think the way that she approaches it is that all stories are stories about power. It's something we don't often acknowledge and include in our coverage. And so that is why I wanted to put this together and also include caste, because that is an emerging subject that often a lot of us don't know how to cover, or best practices on that. So yeah, thank you so much for you all being here. And I'm excited to have more workshops that'll be helpful.
Should I
Okay.
begin? Yeah. Oh, sorry.
No, I had a brain zap. So Sandhya started out at Iowa Public Radio, and she's been in public radio for how long?
Technically, even before I went to J school with Shri, where he was teaching. I have been working in public radio newsrooms in one way or another since 2016.
You started out with sort of covering heavy politics and then moved towards especially looking at a social justice lens. So you covered policing, you've covered, there's this incredible podcast that she's done also about the, demographics of cities and suburbs and how that shifts. American Suburb, I highly recommend all of you listen to it. And now she is the race and identity reporter at NPR, has been doing some hot button issue topics that she's been covering. For that, she was working at KQED. And it comes down to, I think, the work that she's done has come down to sort of being very careful about what information we put out, explanations, and also acknowledging those systems of power, which is what we're going to be working on today.
Hi, everybody. I'm so happy to be here. And for those of you who I know, hi, familiar faces. So this is a kind of version of, something that I've talked about a lot. And I'm going to share my screen here. Okay, hold on. I want to make sure we're on the same page. Okay. So this is something that I've talked about a lot. I've been working on, this idea of the sort of the what I call the power narrative edit, right? Which is this idea that we edit stories for facts, right? This is what we do. We fact check stories. We make sure that everything in there is correct. But something that I try to do as well is to make sure that in our stories as well, we are also making sure that we're getting power right. Like we're fully understanding who has the power in the story and who we as journalists are giving power to. As somebody who covers race in America, and I really, NPR calls that the beat race and identity. And I don't always love that, right? Because I think of race, it is about identity, but it's also, race in America is very much a system of power, right? Race isn't real. It's something we invented, but it has become real. And so how do we understand it both as a system of power, a system that has been used to subjugate folks into different spaces and sectors, a system that perpetuates today, even though there's very much a narrative push to deny the reality of systemic racism happening, with attacks on CRT and then DEI. How do we understand race in these complex ways, but also just tell stories about people and their lived experience? That's not always easy to do, but it's something that I try to do. And so I'm going to share with you this kind of tool I use for how to do that. And I want to make sure that, let me see, this is the full screen. There we go. So this is a model that was introduced to me by a friend of mine, Chenjerai Kumanyika, who's an amazing journalist and has a podcast coming out about the history of police in New York City, the history of NYPD, which will be amazing because the work that he does is incredibly rigorous and is also all about power. But we were talking, we were going to present this thing. So he was like, what about Thompson's model? And I was like, what are you talking about? He said Thompson's model. It's known as the PCS model, this personal cultural instructional analysis model. And what it's supposed to do for sociologists, right? Like the big thinking people who've got their heads in books all day and are studying people and cultures, which is kind of what we do, except without the books all day. So much of what we do is sort of sociology and anthropology and field work. But it's supposed to explain for sociologists how power relationships are expressed between individual groups and in the wider society. So you have the personal, the cultural, and the structural. I think most reporting tends to fall into the personal and the cultural, right? We love personal stories. And even when we do a big structural story, a big investigative piece, you have to find a person, right? People are our doorways into storytelling and to reporting. This thing is happening to people. Here's a person it happened to. That's kind of the classic model. But but sometimes I think we keep things really in the realm of the personal, right? Where, for example, you'll see the headlines that are like, oh, this person, had to raise all this money to make sure they could get a car so they could drive to work, or this person had to, like inspiring story of child who crowdfunded, to get a needed medical operation, and like it stops there, and it's like, okay, here, this is my least favorite variety of American storytelling, because it's like that you're telling a personal story, right? And you're framing it as this inspiring story about someone overcoming odds. But really what you're not getting at is the fact that we live in a country where healthcare is so expensive, you have to crowdfund, even, to kind of survive. And so that gets sort of buried because we're just focusing on the personal, right? Then often we tell stories about the cultural. And I think those stories are incredibly important because we need to understand how our cultures work, right? How we operate in terms of our cultural context, and how those things kind of sometimes bump up against other cultural contexts. But I think if we stop there, we're limiting actually the kind of the understanding of the real forces at play, which to me are often about power, right? And that is looking out to the structural. And so my kind of challenge to myself and to other reporters who I work with is, can we get at the personal? Can we make sure we're including the cultural, but can we also go one step further and always be aware of the structures and systems that are operating in the stories we tell? So taking you to a pet peeve of mine, which is, there has been much discussion of what's going on right now, the culture wars, and how we are in a massive culture war. And, you'll hear and everyone describe what's happening at school board meetings across the country as the culture wars, what's happening on abortion as the culture wars. And I hate this term. I just despise it. And the reason I despise it is because I think it's deeply inaccurate. One, the term was invented, and you can always trace sort of the origins of things. The term culture war was actually invented by sort of far-right Christian nationalists and evangelicals, in order, I think, to describe what they were engaged in. But I think it is a softening of a deeper and bigger project, because we're not just talking about wars over culture, right? We're not just talking about, I have this culture, you have that culture. We're talking about things like civil rights. We're talking about things like religious freedom. We're talking about things like bodily autonomy. And those are beyond just culture, right? Those are just, they operate on every single level of our existence. And so there's a way in which calling it a culture war, I think, minimizes the actual thing that's happening. And it also distracts from the power players involved, right? Like, yes, these are wars around culture, but they're not just that. There are forces at work, right? There are powerful forces at work that are working to help divide us. Now I'm going to sound like a conspiracy theorist, right? But in a certain sense, I think doing reporting these days is to understand the larger projects at play and who's funding them, who's behind them, and who's pushing them. Only when we do that are we actually getting stories right and understanding how our cultures are impacted and how our personal lives are impacted. Another brief example is going to be like the way we talk about political reporting. This is from a few years ago. I thought about pulling up some about the feeding frenzy that's happening around Biden and his age right now. But I thought that this would work as well, where, political reporting is often, I think this is the complaint about it. I'm sure you've heard it many times, probably uttered it yourself. It's often about it being a sort of dog and pony show. It's often about the horse race. It's often about the personalities of the politicians. And in this way, I think it so often fails us because it fails to go outside of the personal kind of anecdotes about the people in power. And it fails to go, like beyond the sort of cultural context of Washington, D.C. so often, into the structural, right? And the structure, the system here is democracy. And so I feel like the politics reporting is a perfect way to sort of take the PCS model and say, like, it's stopping with cultural. It's not always going, it's talking about the culture wars, but it's not always taking us to the systems and the structure. And we are beginning to talk more about the threats to democracy and what that actually means, and to the deeper threats to our systems. And I think that's deeply important, because it's the systems that at play that will impact everything else, from who wins the culture wars to how our personal lives are lived and what we are allowed to do. And so, I often wish politics reporting would learn a little bit more about the PCS system, and not always just focus on the personal and the cultural, not always, talk about the way people are feeling or the personality, but, from this tweet, the power center of so much of American life, politics, and economics, which is what the Supreme Court is, which is what the White House is, which is what these other systems are. And democracy is what happens to people, right? Like it's us. Here is my very shorthand list of tools and techniques that I'm sure many of you already practice. One is looking at how to do non-extractive reporting, right? So like if we are reporting on marginalized people, if we are reporting on people of color, on those who are economically disadvantaged, on those who are in the crosshairs, right, of systems that are set up to attack, divide, or punish them. How do we do non-extractive reporting? How do we not just take and steal someone's story? There's this beautiful line that I've used before, and I've heard it used before. It's how to be a storyteller, not a story taker. And I think that that's something that I'm always grappling with, particularly because so often what we are asking for when we get that personal story that's supposed to, tell this larger tale, is we're often asking for someone's painful story, right? For the worst thing that's ever happened to them. So how do we make sure that we're not just extracting people's pain in order to kind of, bolster our narrative, and instead actually attending to their full humanity? And that is an ongoing discussion, but there are tools and techniques for that. And I'm happy to share some of those as well. The other thing I think is, I often hear people talk about sources as characters. This actually comes from Ambreen Bhatti, who I worked with at KQED, who wrote a Neiman piece several years ago about, casting your characters for stories, and how we shouldn't do that, because we shouldn't think of people as characters, because that makes them into chess pieces, not full-bodied human beings who are experiencing things. And so this is, this idea of I'm casting, right? Is there a way for us to not cast, right? And sometimes you have to do it. You've got an investigative report, you're looking for someone who a certain thing has happened to. But how do we move away from the kind of idea of auditioning and saying, I think in public radio this happens a lot too. Do they give good tape? Do they sound good? Because what we're doing there is we're pre-describing the idea of what sounds good, which again is dictated by systems of power, and therefore limiting who is allowed to tell their story and own their own story. The other thing that I like to talk about is structural empathy. This idea of empathy as this great, great good. I think it's very important, but overused, particularly in spaces like public radio, where sometimes I think we substitute empathy for structural understanding. So I remember a piece on StoryCorps a few years ago that was about a sort of Trump bro and a hijabi Muslim woman who had her hijabs yanked off of her head, and the Trump bro who had felt that he'd been called a racist. And, they brought the two of them together to talk about, to have empathy with each other in this moment in the post-2016 world. And I hated that story. I thought it was bad. And I thought it was bad because it substituted empathy for an understanding of how power works and who's at stake and at risk in that conversation. We can't empathize our way out of the systems of power. We need to have empathy with each other. And I think it's no coincidence that empathy is under attack, and including, like literally teaching empathy in public schools is one of the things that's being targeted right now. But I also think we need to be very aware of the limits of empathy. I, as a half white, half Desi person, am not going to necessarily understand what it's like for someone, for example, like Divya, to live in the South right now. I'm not going to understand what it's like for a Black woman. My empathy is good to try and have that, but I also have to understand how it's limited, right? I don't know better, and I can't always fully understand. So that's the idea of structural empathy, is how do we actually try to understand the systems that impact people's lives? Can we envision the way in which systems are operating on people, and then try to have empathy through that, right? Like, can we say like, okay, you are at the crosshairs of all of these different systems that are coming down on you, and I'm going to have empathy for you in the full vision of all of these things that are occurring to you and all of these forces that are playing out upon you. The other thing I like to talk about is narrative reparations, which is fundamentally this idea that we as journalists owe narrative reparations to the voices that we have tried to control and write stories for so long. Those we have defined narratives for. And how do we do our work from a point of view of narrative reparations, of giving back the story, giving back ownership of the story to the most marginalized, to those without power, to those who have been at the crosshairs of oppressive systems. And so I like to think about narrative reparations and how I can do that work, right? Like how I can not make it about me, not make it about reporting, not make it about these larger things always, but also about giving control of the story, or this would be lived experience. You would hear that. But it just also means like, how do I restore and repair with storytelling? Who gets to decide what's happening to them? I have found oftentimes one of the ways I do this is like, sometimes, we have this system where we're like, okay, go talk to an expert. But oftentimes, particularly amongst marginalized people, the biggest experts on what's happening to their communities will be them themselves. So how do we stay away from, we need someone to tell us about you and allow you to tell us about yourself and what's happening to you? And finally, the last tool is the power narrative check, which I am going to share with all of you. And it's just this tool. It's like lives online. Y'all can look at it. It's something that I do before I tell a story. And it's, we fact check stories for accuracy. I think we should be checking them for power. And so, these are questions to ask yourself as you, through all stages of a story, as you pitch it, as you report it, and as you write it. Who are you covering this story for? Or why are you covering this story? Who is it for? Who are you centering in the audience of your story? This is something that, I know I've heard before, and I'm sure you all have heard some version of this before, but the most egregious version I've ever heard is from an editor, and this was at KQED, and she knows that I use this because she would never do this anymore because we've talked about it a lot. But she once said to me when I was doing a story about what was happening to some Black communities in Oakland, she said, well, why would a white woman in Marin care about this? This is also something that I've heard, other people complain about in other contexts. And the thing is, like, that's the worst possible editorial question you could ask me. Like if you are centering that person, then you're already telling me what you want the story to sound like. And so I always think about like, how can we decenter, right? How can we decenter from the status quo or the person that we have placed, at the heart of our storytelling enterprise, which is often a certain person that does not include but excludes other people. Journalism 101 says we should be mapping out basic things in a stories, right? That's the tension, the stakeholders, the sources, the voices, the facts, and the questions we're looking to answer. And this is stuff I'm sure you all know, that you don't want to set up these sort of false rubrics that you as the journalist are holding the middle between two sides. It's the old, if someone says it's raining and another person says it's not raining, go outside and see if it's raining. Don't just say one side says and the other side says. I think I got a push notification from the New York Times about Project 2025, and it was like, Republicans say this about Republicans say they have a new plan or whatever it is, and then Democrats say it's anti-democratic. And I was like, it's not just Democrats who are saying that, it's experts on democracy and fascism and authoritarianism. So like, let's, be careful we are not making ourselves into a false middle. And then my big thing that I say before I do any story is to find the system in your story. There are obvious ones, like when we report on police, it's the criminal justice system. Of course, there are discrete systems within that. I think there are other systems that are kind of there as well, right? Like for me, I always do consider that white supremacy, racism, class, capitalism, patriarchy, and the ways that all of these things are intersecting with the story that I'm telling. I try to find the system in my story, and I try to find the systems and to identify those early on, so that I can see what I'm actually talking about, what the deeper things are. And then I try to map how power works in my story, so that I'm not going to have what I think so many journalistic outlets have, which is a bias towards power, right? And when I say a bias towards power, it means that we both tend to focus more on those in power, right? This is why there's such heavy, kind of focus on political reporting, because those are the people in power. And while we I don't want to say that we shouldn't be holding power to account. Like, that's literally our jobs. That's why I do this. But it's what is our obsession? Is it holding it to account, or is it giving it authority to dictate the narratives and stories, right? Like, so for example, you guys remember the all these videos of fentanyl and police officers sort of falling over because of fentanyl poisoning and sort of going into shock. And that's not how fentanyl works. So whatever's happening, it's not actually what's happening, but still news outlet after news outlet will run with these stories of fentanyl poisoning threatening officers, when in fact, if you talk to a scientist, you can find out that the narrative is actually very different than that. And so are we just giving authority to police to tell us what the truth is? Because, if we had done that, for example, and not had video footage, in the case of George Floyd, we would have been, we would have probably ran with a very, very different story than the story that emerged, and the one that we understand to be what happened. And that has to do with the fact with excited delirium, which is this very specific thing that I've also reported on, which is, excited delirium is what people die of, or what police tell us people die of, when they die from sort of physical violence in police custody, right? Excited delirium, if you want to know the fun backstory, excited delirium was actually invented by a guy who worked in the morgue in Miami. And there were these Black women, and this was the 1980s, there were these Black women who were dying, and they were dying, often they were sex workers. They were dying often right around the time of having sex. They were often found with cocaine in their bloodstream. And so he decided that they were all dying of excited delirium, right? It had been used a couple of times before on victims of police violence. Often the majority of those are people of color. And so they were like, all right, excited delirium. It's this thing that happens when your body gets so excited, it just dies, it shuts down. And he was trying to make fetch happen with excited delirium. It turns out there was a serial killer, and that's what happened. They were all being murdered by a serial killer. But instead of that stopping the growth and birth of this death diagnosis that doesn't really exist, it actually kind of ballooned across the country. And the guys at Taser International, the guys who make tasers for police, started handing out, these treaties, like this book that was written about excited delirium, at police conferences. And then police officers across the country started using it. And then, you have people who are, killed in an encounter with police, and police say excited delirium, and the doctors who work for the sheriff department say excited delirium, and all of a sudden there's no police accountability because they've invented a death. California actually was the first state to ban the use of excited delirium, but it doesn't go back. So I know families who their children on the record died in an encounter with police of a death diagnosis that is no longer considered accurate or legal, and yet that's what it says on their death certificate. So again, that's the difference between trusting those in power as authorities or holding them to account. And then, I think it's also about who doesn't have power in your story, right? And how do we make that balance out? And this can be incredibly complicated, but countering the power bias in our own work is deeply important. I'm rambling now. I apologize. So, I think about power operating in our stories in two ways. Who has the power in the story that you're telling, right? And so you kind of can mark that and be like, right, this person has the power, so I need to be wary or understand how that power is operating. And then who are we giving power to? as it, like, who in our story is sort of getting to control the narrative. And sometimes we want it to be so that, like, everyone has the chance to say what they need to say, especially when it's around complicated things, which are some of the things that we're going to get to. But I think we always want to be aware of who we're giving power to and who has the power. And if both of those things are the same side, we know we're power biasing. That's not a word, but, you know, like, I will point to another narrative that that went kind of crazy, and this is sort of like a story in 3 headlines. You heard about, and I know those of you who live in the Bay Area heard about, you know, basically the doom loop narrative. It's now infected Oakland. You know, thieves ransack Walgreens store. There's this panic about crime that comes in after the racial justice protests of 2020, on like clockwork. Massive panic about crime. There are spikes in crime. Not huge ones, but a lot of them have to do, as the research is coming out now, with sort of violence and other things that happened around the pandemic. But instead, there's this narrative that defund is responsible and the racial justice protests are responsible. And so you have this, you know, story about San Francisco and Walgreens and, you know, thieves ransacking the Walgreens, and Walgreens now the Walgreens are closing because of all of this crime that's out of control, and it's all the fault of a progressive prosecutor. This is the narrative we're told. And then, like, a year later, it turns out that, like, oh, actually, we overstated the threat around shoplifting. Walgreens says, you know, the quote was, maybe we cried too much last year over retail theft, but the damage is done, right? Because there's been a very real attack on certain ideas of criminal justice reform. And so, you know, that is a case in which there was a back narrative by folks who were in power and by the status quo that was actually pushing back against something deeper. And then finally, I just wanted to kind of acknowledge that this is something that I also want to talk about, and that is reporting on caste, which is incredibly complicated. I know at least one of you, Sonia, has been with me at almost every stage of reporting on the kind of caste equity movement in California since I started in public radio, I mean, over a decade ago. You know, this is something that becomes more and more important for us to keep an eye on, not just sort of what's happening around caste. There was a bill in California last year that would have banned discrimination on the basis of caste. It actually passed despite a lot of opposition from groups that claimed that the bill was inherently Hindu-phobic. But the governor then vetoed it at the last minute for reasons that are probably much more complex and interesting and have to do with power in very, very, very weird ways. But, you know, there is now a push, I think, across the country to, and I'm gonna close this down. Let me stop sharing again. So there is now a push across the country to ban, to sort of do these Hindu-phobia bans, to do something that some reporters have marked as very similar to the way in which anti-Semitism is being redefined. And there are progressive groups that are very concerned that you know, that this is actually, that Hindu-phobia is being weaponized to make sure that people can't talk about caste and to make sure that people can't criticize Hindu nationalism. There's also spreading Hindu nationalism within the US. I've got some reporting going about a Georgia, Atlanta suburb that's like a hotbed of Hindu nationalism in their local politics. So, you know, these things are ever, ever present as we see projects for religious nationalism and religious extremism take hold in different countries around the world in ways not unsimilar to what's happening in the United States with the New Apostolic Reformation and evangelical charismatic Christians who are very much aligned with the Christian nationalism that is being pushed by the Republican Party. So this is this larger project, right? And it's all connected. And there are these parallels between things that are happening internationally and that are happening on the soil here. I want to open this up because I want to know if you guys have stories that you want to workshop or think through the power narrative edit with. I'm going to actually share that here. Here's this document for everyone to look at if they want to. Again, you can take what you want from it. You can throw it away entirely. But I wanted to know if anybody had stories that they were struggling through, thinking about power, thinking about complicated ways in which systems are working in their story, because I'd love for us to workshop that together.
Sandhya, it's Sri here while everyone's getting their questions and sharing their stories. Thank you so much. That was terrific and very helpful, even for a veteran journalist like me. While everyone's getting their questions, just to and Divya, I'm sure will have questions for you also. If you can just touch upon the covering caste and how difficult that's been, and if you can tie it, you spoke a little bit about the Hindu nationalism and what's happening with that. I think not enough people are covering that story, so I look forward to seeing your reporting on that.
So, and I want to bring Sonia in on this because she is also somebody who, covers this really, really deeply. Caste is incredibly difficult to report on in the United States. And I think it's difficult because caste is a system of power, right? Like we understand that it's not like race. And I think people graft it onto race. And that can get us into trouble. But in the US, you're also talking about what's playing out in power dynamics between a community that has, in a community that is marginalized, right? Like, so you're not necessarily just talking about like white supremacy and like you're talking about Desis, right? Who have suffered the, very real Hindu phobia. They're, the like very real attacks. And, I did a story a couple of years ago. Yes, Hindu nationalism is real, and yes, that's spreading, but also like, there South Asians are, of all the Asian American groups, South Asians vote the most progressive. And some of the most progressive like politicians in this country are South Asians. Lots of the Trump team is also South Asians, and we've got, so we really run the gamut. But it's interesting to see that there's a lot of sort of like progressive ideas around South Asians. And of course, where does that come from? Well, it came from 9/11, right? It came from watching what happened when the state weaponizes itself against you, which, happened to anyone who was brown after 9/11 or had a brown sounding name or was, this new category. Sanjay Mishra, the political scientist, basically says this new category of race is invented after 9/11. It had been there before, but it really comes into full being of being a brown person. And, I think that sort of radicalizes a lot of people and makes them aware of how sort of systems of oppression like race work. But we've seen a shifting away from that, right, towards these more extremes. Yes, please jump in, towards these more extremes. And so as we see conversations around caste in the in the Indian communities kind of emerging, it's complicated because it doesn't always fall along the lines that we might be used to grafting things onto. And so we have to kind of be aware of like multiple layers of marginalization, multiple layers of oppression, multiple layers of sort of things that are going on. On the other hand, you'll see folks on the sort of pro-Hindu, anti-caste ban side borrowing things from the right? Like, so I've been in conversations where I've been told by these folks that like, they'll send their kids to college and their kids will, get radicalized in college and come back talking about how caste is a system of power and how maybe it's, problematic. And they'll say that they're being taught in college critical caste theory. So that's clearly borrowing a narrative from the right to map what's happening around caste onto. Sonia has written about how woke has also been used around this as well. And so we also have to kind of recognize that caste becomes something different here because it gets grafted onto all of these things that we see in our own politics.
I had a question. Hi, Sandhya. First off, thank you so much for putting this on and just for putting on such a thoughtful presentation. I really, really appreciate it and learned a lot. Caste is also something that I am really interested in and have done some reporting on. But something that I feel like I struggle with and would love your advice on is how to kind of include the perspective of I guess the critiques of these bills that are trying to ban caste discrimination to the people who are crying Hinduphobia and saying these bills are Hinduphobic. How do we like include that perspective in the storytelling without falling into the trap of like advocates say this and opponents say that?
Yeah, that is really, really hard. I don't know that I have mastered that, but I do let people try to speak for themselves. I do let people try to speak for themselves, and like I hope that in doing that, they reveal something, right? Just if that makes sense. So there's actually a story I thought about playing you guys, and I might actually play it for you, because it was a story in which I really struggled with doing that. It's short; it's just 3 minutes. So maybe I will play that, and then we can talk about like if I fell into that trap of this side says, or if the quotes that I picked reveal something. And I don't know. And look, I think that there are also, I just want to say like, and there are critiques of both sides to be made in terms of what's happening around this. And we need to be very like aware of that. I want to be vague about it since this is being recorded, but there are critiques of both sides to be made. And so I think we need to be critical of everyone who's saying something, right? Because this is a story in which everyone is trying to control the narrative. And there's a narrative on those who are saying that this is Hindu-phobic, that the other side controls the narrative, and they are sort of a more marginalized voice in this. And that's kind of like, it's kind of true. But there are also facts and realities. And so I try to cling to those as much as possible. But it's really, really difficult because, again, this is about how we define things, which, as we have seen in the last year since October 7th, how we define things can make facts seem much more slippery than they really are. So I'm going to play you this. Yeah.
Thank you, Sandhya.
Yeah.
While you're doing that, just to remind folks, we're after this segment where she talks about the story and then responds, then what we'd like to do is just turn off the recording so you can have a more kind of off the record conversation and also answer Harmeet's question. And as you know, Sandhya, one of the things I'd love to hear you say at some point is reflect on, your title is amazing, right? National Race Reporter at NPR. We just saw that the race team at CNN has been pulled back. So, well, what is, if you can reflect on those realities of the business of covering these very important topics would also be good. So we're going to play this clip, and then she's going to talk a little bit more, and we're going to say goodbye to the recorded audience. Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Is that the end? So let me.
And that Seattle, as we have reported, is the first American city to protect people against discrimination based on caste. California could become the first state. NPR's Sandhya Dirks reports.
When Rita Meher immigrated to America over 2 decades ago, she kept her caste a secret.
This is very personal for me.
That's Meher speaking in February at a Seattle City Council meeting about finally coming out of the caste closet just the month before.
I publicly came out as an Adivasi. Adivasis are indigenous tribal communities who face untouchability along with Dalits.
Caste is a hierarchical system of power found in South Asian cultures and religions, and it's complicated. Adivasis like Meher are so far at the bottom as to kind of be outside the caste system, while Dalits are the lowest caste, the ones that used to be called untouchables. Meher says the reason she got so emotional at that council meeting,
It just hit me, the years of oppression and the racism or discrimination I had faced. It just got released. I felt free.
Schools like Brandeis, UC Davis, and the whole California State University system have added caste as a protected category in recent years. Now, State Senator Aisha Wahab wants to add California to that list. She says as we become more diverse, we have to understand discrimination exists in other cultures too.
A lot of back home politics are getting in the way of the full potential of an individual.
Wahab's district is right in Silicon Valley. South Asians make up a growing number of tech workers, and tech has become a major center for these conversations about caste and casteism.
Caste is complex as a socio-historical phenomenon.
That's Tanmori Sundararajan. She's a Dalit activist and the founder of Equality Labs, which is front and center in the fight for caste equity.
But the things that caste-oppressed people are complaining about are very obviously civil rights and labor violations, open usage of slurs, bullying in the workplace, sexual harassment.
Sundararajan says you don't need to fully understand caste to understand it's a system of oppression. But not everyone agrees with that. Pushpita Prasad is with the Coalition of Hindus of North America, or CONA. She says there are bad apples and individual people might discriminate.
All of us talked about personal stories of discrimination and struggle, but is it systemic?
Prasad says no. She says adding caste as a protected category singles out the religion most associated, Hinduism.
When you start to say that one set of people behave differently from all other sets of people, that's the definition of racism.
Her fellow Kona member, Sudha Jagannathan, is Bahujin from a lower caste. She says caste isn't the issue that proponents of the bill claim it to be, not in America and not back in India.
My own experience, never faced caste. My family was too poor to practice caste or be oppressed by somebody else.
She says these anti-discrimination laws are Hindu-phobic.
It's picking on us with things that do not apply to us in our American lives, forcing us to acknowledge that we are castes. Who are they?
But then Mori Sundararajan says it's not Hindu-phobic to talk about the realities of caste.
It only impacts people that discriminate. If you're not a bigot, it doesn't bother you.
As California takes up this legislation to ban caste discrimination, the battle over who gets to define caste in the United States and whether it's systemic will continue.
Anyway, so that was my attempt to grapple with some of the things we've been talking today and caste and sort of this battle over definitions. And I don't know if I just sort of did this side says, this side says. I think I might have, but it's hard.
Thank you, Sandhya. So with that, anything else you'd like to say before we turn off the recording?
Oh, let me actually, I don't mind saying this on the record for everybody. You asked that question about being a race reporter right now and, you know, seeing the pushback. A lot of, you know, around 2020, right, we had this quote unquote racial reckoning, and that was when a lot of people started hiring race and identity reporters or race and equity reporters. It had obviously been going on for longer. You know, there was a clear understanding, I think, that after this very short and very false and very laughable narrative that racism was over because Obama, we worked into this moment of understanding that actually, you know, racism and race and was just at the center of so much. And we saw, you know, the emergence of Black Lives Matter, which was kind of a new face to a very old civil rights movement, but looking at the way in which police wielded power, particularly on the bodies of people of color, particularly, you know, violence against Black people, and not just violence, but sexual abuse as well. So we also saw, you know, the election of Donald Trump and which sort of brought race to the center. We, you know, then saw what happened when he was there and what happened, you know, since then. It's been all like race is just everywhere. It intersects with everything, as Divya said. And now we've seen a pushback, right? There is a concerted effort to deny systemic racism, which I've been doing some reporting on what CRT really is. And I think you can find, if you look at these school board things, it's basically CRT is basically, you know, saying that racism is systemic in many, many places. That's what it comes down to. And so there's an attempt to say racism isn't systemic. Systemic racism ended with, you know, when the Civil Rights Bill was passed. There's also an attempt by some to say that the Civil Rights Bill was a bad bill and should be overturned, which, you know, I think we're going to see more of. There is a pushback to talking about race, to understanding race, just at the moment when I think race is becoming more complicated than it's ever become before. You know, you are seeing ways in which people of color in different communities are being pulled into extremes on the right and the left. And, you know, you are seeing ways in which we're talking about, you know, the Trump campaign and doing better numbers for, you know, people of color, for, you know, Black voters who might be going towards Trump, particularly Black men. You know, we're certainly understanding that there was this thing, right, which was the what was it called, the Modi Democrat, right, where, you know, South Asians would be all for Modi back home, but they understood the way that South Asians were treated here was better protected by the Democratic Party. And I think that what we've seen is a kind of a slippage of that, right, where there is an appeal of a politics of power and domination, and that that appeals not just to white people, right? Because it can be mapped onto all these other things. And it can be mapped onto narratives about personal safety, right? So I think that we are at a more complicated moment, just as we're seeing people not want to talk about race, which is why I think it's more important than ever to talk about race. But do I worry about losing my job because there are very real forces that don't want me to talk about race? Yeah, sometimes I do.
Thank you very much. I know that Divya is going to come back on. Divya, do you want to do this part on camera or?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Um,
Go ahead.
So I'm going to throw one piece of mine that was a daily quick hit, because that's what you sort of start out with local news. And I want to run through applying that edit, because I did not like doing that story in one day. I was not a fan of having to do that quickly. However, we all have to start out that way. So I'm going to quickly share my screen. Can you see it? Okay, so this is a post-incarceration syndrome. It's a very early subject. It's not recognized by a lot of psychiatrists. It's not in the DSM, but it's basically a mix of everything from antisocial personality traits, PTSD, institutionalization, social sensory deprivation. It's just a ton of things, and substance use. So when people are released from prison, they're going to have to deal with the trauma of that. And now I did sort of a quick profile of this guy who is actually trying to educate other Black folks and people who've exited the criminal justice system, but then don't know how to interact in society, about what exactly this syndrome is. But it's very new for a lot of people. People don't talk about this. And so I'm doing this sort of, if you can read it, it's him sort of talking about explaining his experience with it, how he was when he came out, and everything that was triggering him about that. And, you can see the clicking of a microwave because he had to be in a dorm with 20 other people with a microwave going off at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock. Now I go into researchers and I try to sort of talk about an explanation of PICS and post-incarceration syndrome. I go back to him and I'm talking about how he's trying to make things better, sort of a solution story. But then after that, I'm talking about psychiatry and how people are trying to change stuff. However, one piece of it that I probably did not wish I'd gotten in, more focused on is how the criminal justice system creates this, and how those systems of power add to even creating this. And the problem with my piece, I thought, was sort of coming out of thin air, or I don't go too deep into explaining that power narrative. I'm sorry, it's I know it takes some time to read it, but this is basically researchers saying, oh, they should take this seriously, but I never go into why they don't take it seriously. So I wanted to ask you, Sandhya, about how to put that in like a 400-word story that you're doing on a daily basis, where you're not acknowledging entirely how messed up the system is that puts people in this position in the first place.
So it is incredibly hard to do, like what I'm talking about is really, really hard to do, especially in short stories. I still think you can do it. I actually think this acknowledges that. Like, you don't have to outright say, like, look, our system of punishment basically damages people like far beyond the limits of the time that they are supposed to serve, right? You don't have to say that because you're showing it to us, right? You're talking about this particular, like, this name, right? There's this we know, right, that there's this constellation of, like, the fact that there's even a word for institutionalization, like institutionalization, what happens to you when you're in prison, like, there's this constellation of things that we know. And now there's this word, right, that could be a psychiatric disorder. And people are like, I think fundamentally in that, you are showing that is an effed up thing to cage people in the way that we do, at the rate of more people and again, let me put this in the context of facts, that, that America, and I don't know if you have this in there, but I think, one line that says something along the lines of, America imprisons more people than any other country in the world, and we have, more crime than, so that there's this, that we are the top carceral state, and that it doesn't actually impact violent crime results. And so that might be the sentence that I would add, just to contextualize like how much we rely on incarceration as our method and methodology of public safety, and how much it doesn't actually lead to public safety, which is factual, right? That's something that you can just put in as a fact. That might be the one line that I would add in, just to kind of contextualize the system, right? But other than that, I think it's, it's fundamentally there that like, look, this is a harmful thing. And like, if you had longer, you would want to talk to people who said who would say it's supposed to be harmful, right? But the question is it supposed to damage people beyond the length of their sentence? And the other question, fundamentally at the base of all of these reporting on the criminal justice system is, does it actually make us safer? And I think there is some evidence, right, from multiple experts who study this, that, mass incarceration, there's not some evidence, there's much evidence. There's 30 years of evidence that mass incarceration didn't make us safer. And in fact, instead, we've got new DSM possibilities. So I think, nodding to that, and you could pull research that was already online. You wouldn't necessarily even need to talk with someone. That could have maybe been just an extra bolster for that. But I still think you're doing a really, really good job here, particularly given the time constraints of the story you're trying to tell. And I think it's a fascinating and important story, and you did the work there.
Thank you very much. Hey, folks, we're going to turn off the recording so we can have a more off-the-record chat with Sandhya. But of course, Sandhya, keep in mind that just because it's not being recorded officially doesn't mean somebody could be recording something. So with that, thank you everyone for supporting SAJA, for being part of the community. Check out saja.org, and please come to our convention and the conference and gala awards in October 11th and 12th in New York City. saja.org for all your SAJA needs. Bye, everybody. Thank you.